Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Torbjörn Lodén, and I'm the head of the ISDP's China Center. I'd like to wish you all most welcome to today's webinar, which is part of our Taiwan Lectures series. Modernization, state formation, cultural exchange, and globalization are processes with far-reaching implications. These processes have influenced how we identify ourselves as individuals and the different groups or collectives to which we belong, such as ethnic and cultural groups, nations, and states. Often, far too often, one may think, such questions have taken on political overtones and become the topic of national and international controversies. Not least Taiwan and questions of the identities, both of Taiwan itself and of how people in Taiwan identify themselves and how they are identified by people outside Taiwan, exemplify how politically charged questions of identity can be. The purpose of today's webinar, which is entitled The Complexity and Multiplicity of Taiwanese Identity, is to shed light on the multifarious meanings and implications of the identities of the people of Taiwan. Our two speakers, Professor Yu-Wen Chen and Dr. Washa Silan, may I remark here that Washa Silan is not a Chinese name in any sense of the word Chinese. It's a name in one of the indigenous minorities of Taiwan called Tailai. And I'm sure that I pronounce it absolutely incorrectly, but maybe we'll hear Washa herself pronounce her name later. Our two speakers today are both eminently qualified to talk about Taiwanese identities. They were both born and grew up in Taiwan, but since a few years back, they are now living in Finland. Based in Finland, they are doing excellent work, not just as teachers and scholars in a narrow sense, but also in enlightening us all, the general public in the Nordic countries and elsewhere, about different aspects of East Asian realities. You have all hopefully already read about Julie and Washa on our website, and so I will not waste our precious time here on introducing them further. Instead, and without further ado, I now yield the floor to first Julie Chen and then to Washa. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and after that we will have some discussion. And then at that time, you are all most welcome to raise written comments or questions, which you can do under the Q&A button that you find at the bottom of your screens, hopefully. So with these words, again, most welcome, and especially welcome to Julie and to Washa, and the word is yours. Please, Julie.
Hello, everybody. So I'm sorry for a bit of propaganda here. It's raining in Finland, but I have a nice flower, sunny color in the background, a bit of propaganda. And it's my honor to kind of talk about myself in today's presentation. It's rather unusual because most of the time when I present, I talk about my research results. But I think it will be kind of interesting to share my personal experience and my personal identity with a lot of familiar colleagues. I see the attendees here, a lot of familiar colleagues and students, and that will perhaps stir up some conversation about really the complexity of the Taiwanese identity. So a bit about myself. I think a lot of you know that I'm from southern Taiwan. So it's a city called Tainan, where the first Confucius temple was built on this small island. And very often, you know, when I bump into people who know Tainan or a bit of Taiwan politics, they think, oh, wow, you are from the green stronghold. So the green in Taiwan's politics, there is this green and blue. You have to know the color. So the blue is kind of being considered as more like a pro-KMT than this Chinese nationalist party that lost the civil war with communists and then relocated to Taiwan. And so they have an ideology and policy more pro-China, while the green ones are being more, supportive of the Taiwan's identity, and some of them really want Taiwan to have independence. But so there are still varieties within the green camp. But if we just summarize that there's a blue and a green, and it's being seen often that, if you're from Tainan, the south of Taiwan, you must be a green supporter, naturally being seen that way. And I have to admit, this affiliation or label is not that natural to me. It is a process, in my life's journey to realize maybe I'm also green, but it's not that natural for, it doesn't happen that way. And the reason I share is because I come from a family, my family background, I have blue people and green people in my environment. I don't think as a child when I was born, I don't think I know where I stand. As a child, in fact, you are influenced by the environment you are being put in, right? And what you hear from your parents and teachers, and somehow you gradually decide which side you want to be in, if you ever take side. So in my family, it's something very weird. I grew up in a single parent family. So with my mom and my brothers and my grandmother. And my grandmother, in fact, does not speak any Chinese, not any Mandarin Chinese at all. She speaks Taiwanese as well as Japanese, because she lived in the era where Japan was ruling Taiwan. And so, at home, before I have formal education, Taiwanese, I think it's a normal language, at home, plus mingling with a bit Japanese languages. I didn't speak Japanese at all, but I understand some words because it's repeatedly, you hear it in your household. And but that's one side of my story. And so when I started to go to school, what I mean is primary school, particularly primary school, I started to have a lot of challenges. In the sense, in the primary school, at that time, it was governed by the KMT regime. And the teachers, most of them are kind of royal or have to pledge loyalty to the KMT government. If you think about Communist Party in China now, it's a bit like that, in that time. So a lot of teachers are always like supporters of KMT, and they think that we should speak Mandarin Chinese. And as a child, you quickly learn Mandarin Chinese. So it's not a problem. My Chinese was quite okay. But I recall that there were several times in elementary school, I was punished by my teachers because the teacher caught me speaking one word of Taiwanese. But it's in my life, of course, it's in my brain. Sometimes I say something in Taiwanese. And what I think is that when she caught me, she punished me that I have to pay like five cents, as a punishment, So they use this kind of very small mechanism to say you should not speak Taiwanese, which is my mother tongue, in the formal school educations. As a kid, I didn't take it seriously, but I do feel very confused why I cannot say that. And as a child, you don't really question, and I think my family also doesn't encourage me to question the regime. So if I was punished, I just need to learn I have to be careful in the future, that I should not speak Taiwanese in school. Yeah, so that is kind of one side of my story. And then in my family, something very weird as well. But this life could be like this. There are some branches of my family members. They are very closely, they have friends and live very closely as their neighbors. They have like neighbors, basically they are soldiers from mainland China. So those soldiers who have fought with the communist Chinese and then lost the war, and they have to kind of move to Taiwan with the KMT government. But to be honest, there are research about this, and very fascinating research is that a lot of them, in fact, they went to Taiwan involuntarily because they lost the war, and they become like people without home. In a way, you can see them as some kind of refugees trying to find a home in a temporary shelter in Taiwan. So of course, you can imagine this group of people. They have a lot of nostalgia for the China that was lost to the communist Chinese. And they also feel difficulty of integrating into this new environment in Taiwan. So a lot of them find shelters like temples. So one of my relatives actually devoted all her life to live in the Taoist Buddhist temple. and all our families also pay visit to her. And so we have a lot of friends like these men and their soldiers, single men, and they are just there. So of course you can imagine this group of people, they always talk about we want to go back to China, and they are pro the government. They never think about Taiwan independence. At that time, there's nothing really like that in my community. So it's very blue, in today's standard, it's a blue group. Yeah, it's a blue group. So my teachers are blue, and my relatives' friends are blue, and so I should be blue. I guess that's the way it is. And however, I know from my mom, and because my father was divorced a long time ago, I know from my mom that she doesn't want us to contact my father's family, and there are many reasons. There are many reasons in divorce. But one of the reasons she keep telling me is that my father was some part of my father's family. They were very critical of the KMT regime, and they even had to escape Taiwan because at that time KMT regime cannot tolerate anybody who talk about Taiwan's identity, so sovereignty, something like that. So some of them have to kind of immigrate to America, North America, and I never know where they are, but I know there's a branch of my father's side basically went there, and my mom never encouraged us to contact them. So I grew up in a rather blue environment, and all the green elements are being suppressed. And then, then I had a chance. So I was always a Southern girl, a bit innocent and confused about my identity. And then when I went to Taiwan, I think this is something where perhaps a bit similar to something like I share with Washa later on is I think she also went to National Taiwan University, so which is considered kind of one of the best universities in Taiwan, where a lot of elite politicians, officials, businessmen were cultivated there. As a Tainan girl, I was in the Department of Political Science. So in my group, I have classmates or senior classmates who are the children of the premier of Taiwan, the presidents of Taiwan. They are all in NTU. So this is kind of the environment where I grew up. For instance, the former president Chen Shui-bian, his son was in the faculty of law. I'm in the faculty of political science. So we are in the same social science campus, and you will bump into Chen Shui-bian's son. This is just the environment where the university was, and you can see all these elite politicians from the green and from the blues, and they are my classmates. Of course, as somebody who comes from a rather modest background in Tainan, I was rather shy, and but I was curious about those important people's children and listen to their views in classrooms. But I have to say, the environment where I was in, even in NTU, the political science department, I think it's rather blue. So still very conservative, pro-China, pro-KMT kind of people. And then, so all of this, I remember there was one time, I think there was an election. I forgot which election. I think it's the election, one of the presidential elections in Taiwan, and where New York Times sent their reporters to, to write about the upcoming election. And I got a chance to get interviewed by New York Times reporter. I think I might still be able to pick out the news. But being in such a blue environment, and the journalist asked me, who is going to win the presidential election? You know my answer already. It is based on my instinct. I said, of course, the blue candidate, And I think I was wrong that time. In fact, the green won the election. So you can see that where I grew up really influenced me. But then I will have to admit, if now you ask me where I stand, I definitely will not admit I'm a blue person. I would say I'm somehow green. There are different shades of green, somehow green. And where does this green come from? I think it comes from my overseas experience. Perhaps Washa will have something similar here. Is that when I started to go abroad to study, first in Canada and then later in the Netherlands and Germany, when you become a foreigner in the world, and when you face a lot of questions internationally, there are a lot of Chinese diasporas everywhere. And when they see you are from Taiwan. Sometimes I receive quite negative reactions of Chinese people I have bumped into overseas. Oh, you're Taiwan, you must be an independent. And very generalized statement. In fact, that kind of question statement towards me make me take my identity more seriously. And throughout my scholarly journey, I have tried to explore who I am. And I have come to the conclusion, perhaps this kind of overseas experience really changed me. I've come to my conclusions that being a Taiwanese, we are really somehow different. Maybe ethnically, you can always trace me back, like generations ago. I have, my ancestors were from Fujian province in China. But nowadays, I agree with this new trend, a new generations of Taiwanese people who believe that our political path and our societal path has differed from what is happening in PRC. And we have a democracy, we have a vibrant civil society and media environment. This differs us greatly from what is happening in mainland China. And in that respect, I think in my generation and even the younger generation, nobody would wish that one day we return to authoritarian regime. And in that regard, I would say I'm a green person. But I would not say I'm anti-Chinese people, and this is a different thing. I'm not anti-Chinese people. I have also Chinese friends here. Even in today's audience, some of them are my friends. But we differ in the way we see politics and what kind of world, society, where we want to have. So maybe I can stop here, and then I can listen to Washa's different experience. Thank you. Torbjörn, your mic is off.
Thanks a lot, Julie, also for reminding me of turning my mic on. Thanks a lot for sharing these fascinating experience and perceptions with us. It's really very interesting to hear. But before we bring up questions, I will pass the word to Washa. But before that, let me just remind the audience that you are now welcome to register comments and questions under the Q&A button. Please, Washa, couldn't you start by explaining what your name, what kind of language, which language your name represents, and how we should pronounce it?
Yeah, I think you pronounce very well. It's Washa. Washa means like a kind of berry growing in the community in Taiwan. So thank you for making an effort to pronounce it, because I got this identity also along the way when I go abroad, like what Julie has explained. So I think going abroad is really a crystallization of really seeing who we are as a person living abroad. So thank you for recognizing the name and the new identity that I have over the years. So I hope you can see the PowerPoint, because I am still cultivating my personal charisma as Julie, but along the way, I think I will utilize the images to bring you back to the community and where I'm coming from. Right. So it's a privilege and honor to share the complexity and multiplicity of Taiwanese identity, which I feel like I am becoming Taiwanese the more I go abroad and the longer I stay in Finland. So I'm very happy to share this process with you. And I'm doing my postdoc here at the University of Helsinki. And here in the image, you can see that I came from a very different environment from the Nordics, right? Like we have like a lot of mountains and trees, and the bridge has been like removed. And then we have a new bridge now in Ulai, and you're all very welcome to Ulai one day if you have a chance to visit. So before going into, I will quickly acknowledge the land. I will speak in Tainan, which is one of the 16 recognized indigenous groups in Taiwan. It's the third largest group in Taiwan, and it's also where my grandmother belonged to. And now I'm trying to see how I can belong to that group. So the Taiyan people. So ni kaniga nyuksakumaki kalang Finland hiji na Helsinki. Taiyan samizo kanika ini na bakbalai baki babar reheyannya kawan ipi sunek sunan mebekan isu. Skura maku karang samizok tematuk tunusku bebenekis naha arin serarannya tehomisu yaka anasu babalnya. So today I'm speaking to you from the Sami land, and it's the unceded land of the Sami people. I want to acknowledge the elders who have taught us all this knowledge. Without them, there will be no knowledge. So today I'm going to share Taiwanese identity through my own story. It is a very personal story, and I hope that there will be something that you can connect with and we can discuss further later in the Q&A. So this is the village where I'm from. It's from the northern Taiwan. It's a great place for swimming and bird watching and all these beautiful, nice natural activities. And it's called the Wulai village. And growing up in the village, I have never really think about Taiwanese identity or what that means to me. So I will talk about this kind of complicated story through the process of how my name has changed. So I have many names throughout my life. When I was born, I was given the name Chen. Chen is a name from my grandfather, which is a KMT general from the Guangdong province. And on the right-hand side, you can see his stars, right? Like he's an important person. And then he has been doing all kinds of this like military work. And then he met my grandmother, a Tainan Indigenous woman in the village. So he stayed. So my last name, Chen, is from his family. And he has always told me that, oh, this is this ancestor from the Chen dynasty, you know, like you can read into the history and then you can find all our ancestors from this proud and glorious history of China. So when I was born, I was like, thinking that, oh yeah, so cool, there's a group of ancestors in China. And then I've always think myself as a Chinese person, you know, like growing up and learning to speak Chinese and no other language was allowed to be spoken. And Yan basically means easygoing and safe. And I think that signifies that my parents are thinking that, yeah, it's the year of the martial law being lifted and we just want you to grow up safe. So in the basic education years, I have been using Chen Yan. In addition to that, I have been using Grace, because in Taiwan, I think many of us have an English name. So with the English name that we have like this aspiring to be like recognized by the international community, but then not being recognized. So then you want to like kind of connect it to the international people and the US, right? So then we have an English name, which means American name. And Grace also signifies the Christian religion from the indigenous community, which is very prevalent. Many of us are Christians. So Grace is like a God's grace. And then you get to, and I have been to church like every Sunday, and it's part of my identity. And it's just very natural to me that I never really think about how strange or how, I thought that everybody in Taiwan has the same experience. You have somebody from China and they teach you to be Chinese and then you go to church. That's probably what I think that people would be in growing up in Taiwan. But then as Julie has pointed out that during the educational years, I gradually know people from different kind of backgrounds. So in the picture here on the left-hand side is my high school, on the right-hand side, it's a university. So I have been seeing slowly all these indigenous students getting extra points for being indigenous students and getting into this higher education institute, but kind of being discriminated for being indigenous, because I can hear that the other hand students will say that, oh, they only get to this superstar high school and university because they're indigenous and they get extra points and they don't deserve to be here. And then it is very hostile. So when I wasn't on my ID recognized as indigenous person until the second year of my university. But I think that was because there was just so much hostility and discrimination still in the air, and I did not feel comfortable to be recognized, right? Like, I don't want to be stick out. If I can perform well, I don't need indigenous. I don't need to be indigenous. I can still get into the schools without being ridiculed and discriminated. So during that year, I have like passed through in the high school and university. And until the second year of my university, I had been always called Chen Yan. And then my father suddenly get this moment of truth. And then he get a conversation with my grandma. And he said that, well, maybe now we can slowly kind of learn how to be a Taiwan person, you know, like there is land that we need to take care of and we need to manage. So then on the second year of my university, my dad changed from his ID from Chen to Gao. And from the status law of Taiwan, changing your last name is you can have the indigenous status, because my grandmother is a Indigenous person. So we changed into her last name. So it's still a very Han Chinese law, but that is how Taiwan law now works for Indigenous status. So then I got this name of Gao Yan. And then it was not until the second year of my university that I started to think like, okay, I'm now an Indigenous person, but what does that mean? So then I started to get to know more Indigenous students and then participate in the Council of Indigenous Peoples events. But all the while I've been using grace because I feel like, yeah, it's I can call it in Chinese all I want, but for international people, they cannot pronounce my name. So I have to use grace. But then after years of staying in Finland and then starting to look into the community and thinking about what Taiwan people's health and well-being mean, and then being able to stay a lot of time with my grandmother. And I started to realize that why don't I just call myself Washa, which is a name that she gave me. And it means on the right-hand side of the picture, this berry that grow in the community. In Chinese, it's longkui. So it's like these very small, sweet berries that grow like in the bushes of the community. So I was thinking that, yes. And then I would start to call myself Washa because that is I don't know, elder's blessing. And there's I don't have to change myself in order for other people to pronounce my name. I should have the name and then have the right to use that from the family. So to sum up the story, that I think my story is not an Indigenous story through and through, but it represents many of the younger people of my generation. So it is a process of becoming Indigenous, but becoming Indigenous does not mean that there is no problem, right? So all the time I have this constant fear that I don't feel that I'm Indigenous enough because I was not brought up as an Indigenous person. People will come up and speak to me, both Han people and non-Han people, saying that you don't speak perfect Tainan language. Oh, you don't look like us. You're not dark enough. You don't have big enough eyes, or you don't have the right shade on your skin. But then I started to realize that being an Indigenous person is not only about speaking perfect Tainan language or, oh, you don't look like us, but it's also about something else. So in addition to the bloods or familiarity of the culture and language or your appearance, there is something more at stake, which is embracing the fluid process and stay committed to this identity. And then going back to becoming Taiwanese within this framework, I think for me, it is also a process of becoming more Taiwanese throughout the year. So this picture is this song that my grandfather likes to sing and watch on YouTube, which is the national anthem of Republic of China. Yes, so it basically goes like "三民主义无党所宗," and then he will sing the whole song. And then so I feel like looking back that I was brought up in a very deep blue KMT family, and KMT is really an ideal from both my mother and father's side, that it is the perfect party. It is non-ideological and it wishes the best for the people, and it has economic prosperity. Everybody's going to be better off. So it's basically the KMT ideal that I was taught when I grew up. And then I could say that I used to identify as a Chinese person, not as a citizen of Communist Party, but as ethnically Chinese. But then slowly I started to think and becoming more Indigenous and becoming more Taiwanese. And now when I speak to my mother back home, and she would say to me this very interesting sentence. Actually, she just said it yesterday to me when I told her that I'm going to have this sharing about identity. And she's like, I don't know what happened to you and how did I do to you? What education that I have failed you, that you even recognize yourself as a DPP supporter, or you have even voted for Tsai Ing-wen. He said that is a betrayal of the whole family. You shouldn't have done that. And I kind of understand because they're still very deeply KMT, but I think the longer that I stay abroad, the longer that I feel that there's a distance between me and my family and all these histories and what is taken for granted, that I realize that there is all kinds of like many shades in between. And I think I wouldn't recognize the KMT as they see now, because I think it's so walking a very dangerous line. But yeah, that is my story of becoming Taiwanese and becoming Indigenous Taiwan in a nutshell. And I hope that we can have more conversation and discussion, and hopefully this is something that we can talk about and open up later on in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Washa. This is really fascinating. I thought that we should, before opening up for a general discussion, I thought that you both should have a chance to make some comments on each other's presentations. But before I give the word to you, I would like to raise, for me, a very basic, but very simple, simplistic question, but it is nevertheless important, question of linguistic terminology. When I listened to you, Julie, I got the impression that you use now the word Chinese in English as a synonym for Mandarin. Is that true? I mean, for me as an old-fashioned sinologist, this is something new. For me, Chinese is a language that encompasses many different languages or dialects. But is it the case now that in Taiwan, Chinese is more or less a synonym for Mandarin? And Chinese in Chinese, then, is that Zhongguohua? The language of China. What about, do you at all use the word Han, the language of the Han people? And if you use that, is that also used synonymously with Mandarin? And when you speak about Taiwanese, when you refer to Taiwanese, Julie, then I got the impression that you refer to what I, as an old-fashioned sinologist, would refer to as the Taiwan variety of the Fujian language, which I would also categorize as Chinese. But then when we come to Washa's language, the Taial, then of course we have transcended beyond the borders of what I would also call Chinese. But please tell us about this. Has this changed in recent years? Has the meaning of Chinese become more narrow as Taiwan has become more de facto estranged from mainland China?
Yeah, what Wasai or the audience can correct me, but I think currently when we say Chinese, or actually when we grew up, we say 国语, the language of our country. And I think most of the time that actually refers to this Chinese, the standard Chinese that you hear widely in China as well, Mandarin Chinese. Taiwanese, to be honest, I think it's an artificially created identity and language. You know, because if you want to really, like, I think you believe that Taiwanese language or Holo language, you know, from Fujian province is one of the Chinese languages. So I think the term Taiwanese is now used because of Taiwan's process of democratization and then having more its own self-identity. So you created this category, say Taiwanese identity and the language, which means Taiyu. And then Taiyu, of course, in terms of linguistics, is very closely related to Holo language or the Mainland language in China. There are a lot of similarities in it, and I think people in both sides can communicate without problems. But in order to enshrine our own identity, I think now we really think the Taiwanese is our language somehow this way. I hope I answer your questions.
Yes, you do. I think this is enlightening, and you also remind me of the term Goi. I suppose some of our attendees may not know Chinese, and we should perhaps then tell them that the word generally used for Mandarin in Taiwan is Goi, which literally means the language of the country or of the nation. And of course, this term has nothing to do with the Kuomintang, as far as I know. Originally, it has been used for a long time, long before Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan. But it's true that if you compare with mainland China, the equivalent term, or the term that is used to refer to Mandarin Chinese in mainland China is 普通话, which as a word does not connote a nation. Interestingly enough, because if anything, the communist government in Beijing is more statist, more nationalistic than in Taiwan. But the word itself does not have this connotation of a national language. And the word, do you in Taiwan use the word 中国话 at all, or is that very rarely used?
No, I think if you're from mainland China, you would say 普通话 or 汉语. You know, 我在学汉语, I'm learning 汉语, but that's really PRC style. I think in Taiwan, we don't do that. But 国语 also a bit, I think I also don't like the term 国语 anymore. You know, of course, they always tell you have to learn 国语, and 国语 is it basically it means it is the standard Mandarin Chinese, right? And denying the importance of 台语, the Taiwanese language. And now, with the change of politics, of course, now we start to pay attention to Taiyu and also to the indigenous people's languages. So I'm happy to see this change. And I don't like the term 国语.
I think we also say 中文, no?
中文, yeah, 中文, Chinese.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't take up too much time, but Washa, would you like to make some comments about Julie's presentation, what Julie said?
The first thing that came to me is related to your question, because I think it was 3 years ago, there was a Sami scholar and also many minority experts coming to Taiwan in this Hakka, International Hakka Language and Minority Language Revitalization Conference. So it is about bringing the experiences of vernacularize and revitalize all these minority languages, including Hoklo or Taiwanese, Hakka, Austronesian indigenous language, bringing the experiences from Catalan, from Spain, and also other places in Europe. And then there was a very heated debate of what is Taiwanese, because there was a speaker saying that, yes, we need to revitalize the Taiwanese language, like referring to the Hoklo language. But then there are other speakers saying that how come only your language is Taiwanese? How come our languages are not Taiwanese? Like referring to Hakka language and indigenous language from different communities. And then I think, as we know that there's indigenous language being recognized as the national language in Taiwan these years, and then there are a lot of this construction of indigenous knowledge throughout these past 2 years, and a lot of funding has been putting into having more research on what indigenous experimental education could be on the basic school level. So I think the language, what is a national language and what is Taiwanese, is really open up for more space for people to define, and who are these people, who are the people, and what do we want the next generation to think themselves as. So it's really an ongoing process.
I think the usage of these terms is really rather confusing, but it's also very nice that you have this lively discussion. I mean, we should welcome that. May I add one historical perspective to this? When you think about it, I mean, if you look at the population of Taiwan, one basic distinction that is often made is between the people who are referred to as Bunsheng people, and on the one hand, and the Waisheng people on the other. The Waisheng, this term refers to people who came to Taiwan after or in connection with the communist takeover in Beijing, whereas Bunsheng people refers to the people who came to originally Han people who came to Taiwan earlier, and not especially people who emigrated from mainland China to Taiwan in connection with the transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty. And then if you look at that, go back to that time, interestingly enough, of course, in this political conflict between the Ming loyalists, those who emigrated to Taiwan, and the new Qing Empire, the Ming loyalists, they thought of themselves as true Chinese. And whereas the new rulers, they were not Chinese because they were Manchu in the terminology of the Ming loyalists. So in a way, those people who say that we are Taiwanese, we are not Chinese, their ancestors thought of themselves as quintessentially Chinese, right? Isn't that a bit ironic? Julie, would you like to say something about what I said, or rather about what Washa said in her presentation?
So maybe I start from kind of responding to your question of this Benshen and Waishen. And it's true, I think historically, these are just different waves of migration. I'm not talking about the indigenous people who have been there, but those waves of migration from China. So, how do you define you are really Waishen and Benshen, right? Because like I know my ancestors, ancestors were from Fujian province. From the Qing dynasty, right? But later now they become a Benshen. So this kind of Benshen and Waishen division perhaps is really not that accurate. But in the contemporary context, it is being used sometimes politicalized in the elections to arouse the feelings and who you are affiliated with and for political purpose. Because it is commonly believed, and there are problems with this kind of commonly belief that Waishen is still more reminiscent of their home country back in China, and they are more pro-China, pro-KMT, and the Benshen are not this way. But I can tell you there are already scholarly work on this. This is not that definite. It is a myth, and perhaps you can generalize it that way. But there are always exceptions. There are Waishen who have decided that or their second generation, third generation feel that I have grew up in Taiwan, so why not enshrine more on the Taiwan identity and not to talk about the past. So there are Waishen who actually can be supportive of Taiwan identity, as well as there are Benshen, and like in fact a lot of my family. I would say they are Benshen, but they are really pro-China. So it's really difficult. And we just have to be aware of when we use the term, what it really means, and kind of remind us of the pitfall of each of these labels. Yeah, that's perhaps my response to you. And my response to Washa, actually, I have to say I envy the younger generations because in my generation, it's impossible to learn your mother tongue. But now I know the younger generations in their textbooks, and they have the right, they have the knowledge of learning about different languages in Taiwan. This is something I really envy, and we don't have. And it's a process, of course, but it's very nice they started. And also another thing that is making the whole picture even more complicated is now we have this 新住民. So, like people who not recently, but the new immigrants to Taiwan and from Southeast Asia, or even mainlanders, mainlanders who immigrate to Taiwan because through marriage, Taiwanese men marry a mainland woman. So they are the new immigrants in the society, and they have different needs and different identities. So slowly there are debates, how they were discriminated, and now there are mechanisms to ensure that they themselves, as well as their children, can also preserve their identity and languages. So this is something that never happened in my generation, and I really envy this. Yeah.
We now have two written questions, so let us proceed to this. Larissa Stinkel, my colleague, writes as follows. Thank you both for your very insightful presentations. Would you say that political changes in Taiwan also have an impact on your identities as Taiwanese living abroad? Who would like to start? Washa?
Yeah, I think if the martial law was not lifted around the time that I was born, there was very limited ways to express your own identity, given the very harshly suppressed political environment that was back then. So, and I think there were many Taiwanese living abroad. They are at the moment categorized not as Taiwanese, but as pro-ROC or ROC affiliated Chinese in a broad sense, right? Like a Chinese dialect speaking people. And that also creates this multiplicity of who are the Taiwanese living abroad, given all the political transformation of the past years. So yeah, I think definitely the political changes in Taiwan has an implication, a very big implication on how we see ourselves as Taiwanese or as Indigenous persons. Because back then you can't recognize yourself as Indigenous. My grandmother refused to speak Tainan to her own children because she thought that it was irrelevant. If they want to be successful, they need to speak good Chinese, which is the 普通话 Chinese, the Hanyu Chinese. You can't speak other languages. So these political changes open up all these possibilities from language to your party affiliation. So yeah.
Julie, would you like to add something on this?
No, I think, maybe in terms of time, I think I'm quite satisfied with Washa's answer.
Let me read the second question then from a Miss or Mr. Chen, who writes, "Hi, I was born in Taiwan in the late 1990s, so I have different experience in the compulsory education, and the social atmosphere is quite different from the era you grew up in. How do you think the identity may change with different growing up environment for younger generation in Taiwan or Taiwanese who live abroad?" Julie, could you start on that perhaps?
I'm not so sure if I understand the question entirely correctly, but my view is the younger generation, so like after 90s and currently, they definitely would have a stronger Taiwan identity than people in my generations, simply because the environment, the learning environment, the political environment has changed. It encourage the so-called maybe multiculturalism in a society, and where you can also talk about more about yourself. And also just look at the change also in mainland China and in Hong Kong. And those changes are worrisome for the younger generations. If they look at their peers in other side, they might feel even stronger and want to protect their identity. I don't know if this is okay. I'm not so sure if I answered the question.
Washa, any comment from you?
Yeah, I think many of my families, like sisters and brothers, they were born in the late 90s as you, and I think there were indeed a lot of the society is much more they're more responsive to who you wanted to become, and there are a lot of this institutional support if you want to be if you want to recognize as an Indigenous person or as another kind of identity that you're ascribing yourself. There are more of these official processes that you can get resource to help you to get to know better, but it was not happening back then, like 2 decades or 1 decade ago. So definitely there are more processes for younger people to recognize, to reclaim their identity, so to say.
Okay, and a fourth, one more question from Andrew. My name is Andrew and I identify as an ethnic Chinese from Malaysia. I'm currently in Taiwan researching how the rise of Taiwanese identity is impacting ethnic Chinese Malaysians in Taiwan. My question to Julie is that the shifting experiences and affiliation shared by her is unique in a broader perspective. Millions of ethnic Chinese migrants have been experiencing it for decades, if not a century. I wonder, where does she see the Taiwanese identity, especially from her experiences, in the context of global Chinese, if not diaspora? And for Washa, thanks for starting with the native language. It's interesting to hear it for the first time. Given the numbers of Indigenous is super small, I wonder if you think the Indigenous people are still living in a colonized environment. So Julie, please, you go ahead first.
Wow, big question. But first of all, I remember when I was a university student at NTU, we have classmates from Malaysia, Chinese Malaysian, but I have to admit at that time, I didn't explore widely their identities. If I think about the Taiwanese identity in the global Chinese community, I think the Taiwanese diaspora have carved out their own space, even in the global Chinese space. So there, you know, in Finland, you will find a Taiwanese group, as well as I guess in Sweden, you will find a Taiwanese group. We are a minority and we are aware of our minority status. And whenever there are chances for us to talk about ourselves, we usually appreciate that. I don't know if I answer your question, you know. So what I mean is that somehow the Taiwanese in overseas, they have been able to maintain their different identity, different from those from PRC. It's not like they don't have dialogues. You know, I'm sure Wasai also have friends from PRC in Finland as me, but we still want to maintain our difference, something like that. Yeah.
And Washa, please.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for the question, for asking if I think Indigenous peoples are still living in the colonized environment. I think that is my whole PhD was about, focusing in the social policy and the elderly care field, and then trying to establish an argument that the apparent colonization that we think as economic expansion seems to come to an end, but that does not mean that colonization has ended. So instead, colonization has explored in more like not so obvious ways in the way how our legal systems in Taiwan has been reproducing. So instead of economic expansion, the colonization has come to continue to into our heads, right? Into our minds of deciding what is legitimized and what is normal, what is considered as an expert, what is considered as not acceptable. So yes, I think Indigenous people are still living in a colonized environment. If you look at social policies, if you look at land policies and the natural resources management and all these other forestry management, Indigenous voices are not being heard. And it's only the Western Han Chinese dominant science that's being recognized. It's still a long way to go. We have just begun from the apology, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. May I perhaps at this stage add a reflection based on also a rather personal experience? In your introductory remarks, Julie, you mentioned that as a child, you were punished even for just uttering a word or two in Taiwanese. And in your presentation, Washa, you refer to your context with the Sami people in Finland or in the Nordic countries. I grew up in the northern town of Kiruna, and I had good friends who were Sami. I also had good friends who belonged to the Finnish minority in northern Sweden along the Torne River. And getting to know them and also reading about it at quite an early age, I came to realize that not in my age perhaps, but just a decade or two earlier, children in that part of Sweden were also punished for talking to each other in their own language, in their native languages. And it's an awful chapter of Swedish history. And you can say that members of these national minorities, they are still discriminated against in different ways. So I bring this up firstly to say that, or to remind us all that cultural oppression or suppression really occurs probably all over the world, and that cultural language is often used as an instrument of oppression. And then based on this, I also reflect, I think that as I think, and I think many Swedes today think about this question, we really think that this old practice was terrible. But for us, it's very important to emphasize that being a native speaker of the Sami language or the Finnish language does not make you non-Swedish. You are certainly you can be very Swedish and at the same time culturally Sami or culturally belonging to the Finnish group. That we think of Sweden as a multicultural society. You are Swedish no matter what your native language is. Citizenship and cultural identity should be separated. Now, in Taiwan, I think it's interesting to compare the ongoing discussion about Chineseness and nationality in Taiwan to this Swedish or European experience. Because as I see it, of course, in Taiwan, I think the vast majority of people nowadays think of Taiwan as an independent country. And of course, de facto, Taiwan is an independent country. And to claim that it should also be formalized as an independent country is by no means, it should not be an outrageous proposition. It's described as outrageous, not outrageous proposition just because of power politics and because of the fact that Beijing is such a powerful government. This is indeed a very reasonable proposition. But in this situation anyway, it seems to me that it's so important for people in Taiwan to base their political thesis that Taiwan is independent on defining Taiwanese culture as independent. Also, I mean, for me, these are two different questions. Just as I think of myself as European and Swedish at the same time, I would think that people in Taiwan could also recognize or think of themselves as Chinese in a broad cultural sense, but still being Taiwanese in as far as citizenship or statehood is concerned. But would you? I don't think I can turn this into a well-formulated question, but when I say this in perhaps a slightly provocative manner, what would your reaction be? How would you respond to this?
Can I start?
Yes, please.
I'm sometimes a bit critical of some policies the current Taiwan government has. I think to some extent I understand it, but to some extent I think it's not positive in the long term, in the sense that sometimes the Taiwan government wants to de-Sinicize Taiwan, and because of the pressure from China and the antagonism. I can understand that. But I think Chinese culture is a very important part of the Taiwan's culture. It's one of it. Of course, we have more than that, and that's the beauty of Taiwan. When I think about Taiwan, I like that we have Japanese culture, we have Chinese culture, we have Indigenous culture, and now a new immigrant culture, and it makes the society far more interesting. And so, as much as I can do, I keep advocating that we should not de-Sinicize Taiwan. Yeah, and the policy should instill also encourage Chinese studies, because in recent years, I even heard some scholar in Taiwan tell me, if you do Chinese study, you will not get funding anymore because the government doesn't want to give you. They want you to do Taiwan or Southeast Asia, but to actually, this is a very short-sighted because Taiwan has a very important hub for doing research on China, when now doing research on China is becoming really, really difficult in mainland China. In fact, Taiwan should use its advantage as being a liberal society to welcome scholars doing research on China to come to Taiwan. Yeah, thank you.
And
yeah,
Washa?
I agree. Yeah, I think just very shortly echo Julie that I don't think we should de-Sinicize the Chinese discussion in Taiwan, and I think sometimes it is really inspiring to listen to Torby and your identity as recognized as a European and Swedish, and then your friends could recognize culturally also as Sami, because I think in Taiwan we're still not so much exposed to the environment where this diversity, or you can be the same person, but then you kind of draw from different cultural things. You don't have to choose. I think for the indigenous younger generation, it is sometimes also a question that, you have to choose that you're 100% indigenous, you're 100% Taiwan, and you're not a Taiwanese or you're not a Chinese. But then it is just very strange because we're people from my background, we grew up in a mixed racial or ethnic group families. So to say that you only belong to one is ridiculous, because you are both. And I think it can have implication on just one person from one family, and also to the national dialogue of what kind of country we want it to become in the diversity sense. But yeah.
Perhaps it would be good to refer to Taiwan as a multicultural society also. Now we have a very interesting question from my colleague Lars Varje, one of the most prominent specialists on Japan in Sweden, who is also a sinologist. He writes as follows: I'm curious to hear a bit more about the view on Japan in Taiwan. In Korea, there is still a lot of bitterness, but it seems the view of Japan and the Japanese is more positive. In Taiwan, I suppose it means. How did the Japanese treat the minorities during the period 1895 to 1945? Well, this is also a big question. Who would like to start? Julie?
I can say a bit about this, and then maybe Washa can talk about the indigenous minority during the Japanese rule. Nowadays, I would say Taiwanese people love Japan. And the reason is because of China. Yeah. It's because of China. I know that in history, of course, Japanese rule on Taiwan was not that peaceful either. There were draconian rules to govern the people in Taiwan, and then force also Taiwanese people to adopt Japanese language during at the later part of the colonization. There was more strict rules that you really have to learn the Japanese language. So of course there were a lot of bitterness, but the reason why nowadays Taiwanese people tend not to talk about it is because of China. The stress and the threats from China made Taiwanese people feel that we would like to get closer to Japan, and politically as well. I think Japan is also more aligned with United States to help Taiwan. So that's the part I want to emphasize. But perhaps Wasai can talk about these minorities facing the Japanese treatment.
Yeah. Thank you, Julie, for the discussion on the global politics point of view, and I agree with that. And just for the interest of time, I was thinking that I learned actually about this period of 1895 to 1945 from this friend of mine's book. It's called Outcasts of the Empire, Japan's Rule on Taiwan's Savage Border, from 1874 to 1945. And in that book, there are a lot of this, I have learned so much about the Ulai village and how does the ethnologists from Japan coming into our village and then doing all kinds of grassroots work that actually help us to revitalize the Tainan language and culture. And I think it's a mixture of bittersweet and hate and then love with Japan. But I think I agree with Julie that in the face of the China threat, it was very easy to like Japan, and at least I think many people, Japanese is it's a common thing that people would speak. That I have never really learned long-term Japanese, but I can speak some Japanese. My brother didn't really like Japan, but then he can just easily like watching all this. It's just very friendly environment to learn Japanese, and he got an N2 certificate. It was so common. People in Taiwan, I think they love Japan, not because Japan did really good things back in the 18th century and 19th century, but because of the current implication of the global politics. But we can discuss more later if we have time.
When you have an interesting time passes very quickly, so we must begin to think about rounding up this discussion. But we have at least one final question posed by my colleague, Dr. Jagannath Panda, who recently joined the ISDP as the head of our South Asia Center. Jagannath comes from New Delhi in India. He writes, "Hello, my name is Jagannath Panda. I'm from ISDP. Excellent discussion. My compliments to all the speakers. One question. Can we say that people in Taiwan will struggle to uphold their Taiwanese identity like the way Tibetans are struggling today? In a way, can we say that the future of the Taiwanese identity will be similar to the Tibetan identity in a larger context? Will you draw a parallel at some stages between Taiwanese and Tibetan identities?" Would you like to start, Washa?
I think it is similar to the extent that it was opposed by the communist China, but there are also a lot of other components. Maybe we won't say that it is so similar, but what would Julie say?
Yeah, I agree. The anti-China element might be the same, but the two identities are different, and they face different conditions. I think Tibetan identity perhaps feel even more suppressed because it's still part of China. Like de facto and de jure. But in Taiwan, given the free liberal society, the Taiwanese identity is just expanding its meaning and growing. So. But fighting and struggling, I think that this comes to another question that has been debated lately, because we've always seen in the Ukrainian war. The question is whether the Taiwanese will stand up to fight for their country, or or when there is a military attack from China. And there are other debates. And currently, whatever I heard, I think people are a bit pessimistic, because it seems that the younger generation, although wants their identity, maybe they are not that really willing to gear up and to fight for these nations when there is a military attack. So there are discussions now, policy-wise, how to change this, and militarily how to restructure so that people feel more willing to fight for Taiwan. So this is my answer. And I just want to quickly mention that I see there's another question, in fact, in the Dobion. Do you want to read that? I think it's from Marianne. It was, or should I read it?
You can read it, Julie. Yeah. But before we do that, let me apologize to Marianne. I just missed it. Sorry. Please, Julie, read it.
Yeah, so I think she's asking about the Taiwanese identity and how it is described in the Constitution. My understanding is the current Constitution in Taiwan is outdated.
Yeah.
Our green people's perspective, because this Constitution is the Republic of China Constitution, promulgated in China, in Nanjing, before this regime is moved to Taiwan. So the way they don't have a Taiwanese identity there. So there are discussions on whether we should create a new constitution or not. But of course, this is very sensitive and political, because if you create a new constitution, then you definitely will cause trouble, and China would not like that. Yeah, so I think there is no Taiwanese identity in the constitution.
By the way, isn't it ironic that this outdated constitution is less objectionable, apparently, to the authorities in Beijing than the new constitution, corresponding more closely to the prevailing realities would be? The world is mad. Our webinar was advertised to come to an end at 12 o'clock. This is not an absolute deadline, but we should wind up now. Still, the final words should go to our excellent speakers. I think this has been a wonderful seminar. To conclude, would you like to say something, Washa?
I just noticed that there are some questions in the chat. Should we answer them, or should we just conclude?
I think we have to postpone them
right.
until time, yes.
Okay, but if I welcome that if there are people who are interested in continuing the discussion, you can reach us. Julie and I, we're on Twitter and on other social media platforms, but it's just such a great pleasure to talk about cultural identities and from the Taiwan perspective. And great thanks to ISDP to giving us this platform. And we hope that this collaboration and the discussion will continue.
And Julie?
Yeah, and for me, just have my consciousness. Of course, two persons speaking here cannot speak for the entire island of Taiwan. There are definitely people who might agree or who might disagree with us to a certain extent. But bearing in mind, I think what we want to emphasize is that the Taiwan identity is far more complex and diverse than what you can read in the Western media. And we wish that maybe more people in Nordic countries can know about this. Yeah.
Yes.
I say, as far as I'm concerned, I think today's presentations and discussion were all excellent and most enlightening in this Nordic context where most of us know shamefully little about Taiwan and Taiwanese identity. It's been really very good to have you with us, and thank you so much. And I should also say, maybe this is I think this is quite important, that we should think of this as the beginning of something rather than something concluded. I'm very aware that we did not answer all questions, and there are innumerable questions that we should dive deeper into also. So let us continue, and let us try to formulate some kind of project dealing with the Taiwanese identities. And let us have more webinars and lectures, and also let us try to get some research going in this fascinating field. So finally, again, and on behalf of the ISDP, thank you so much, Professor Julie Yu-Wen Chen and Dr. Washa Silan, for your participation here today. And thank you also to all our attendees for your participation and for your interesting questions and interventions. Goodbye, and hope to see you next time. And that is to say, I think the China Center will probably have no more webinar before the summer. So we will probably have our next event in August, I would think. Let's see what happens. All the best to all of you, and have a nice summer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Torbjörn. Have a nice day.
Torbjörn.
We keep in touch.
Keep in touch. Keep in touch. Kitos. Bye-bye.
Bye.